Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's fall seminar series presentation hosted by the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. My name is David Muirhuddy, and I am the chair of the Department of Global Humanities, and I'll be responsible for moderating today's talk, which isn't to suggest that it's a radical talk. I will moderate it. I am pleased to present today's speaker, Dr. David Phillips. Dr. Phillips is a professor in the Department of History at UCLA, having been with the department since 2000. He received his PhD in classical studies at the University of Michigan, also in 2000. His research specialty is something I'm very fond of working on, ancient Greek law, and he will be known for this book, a compendium of sources on ancient Greek law, directed for students, but at a pretty high level. Scholars can appreciate it too. Some other significant or recent publications include Avengers of Blood, Homicide, and Athenian Law and Custom from Draco to Demosthenes. And it sounds like we're going to get a prequel on that today. And the Law of Athens book, and the Case of Dracontius and Spartan Homicide Law. I hope you all enjoy today's presentation from Dr. Phillips. David.
Okay.
Yeah, they're in the picture.
Okay, thanks to Professor Muirhuddy for that introduction, and to him and the Simon Fraser Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies for extending this invitation. Thank you all for being here and listening to me. I am honored and very pleased to be here. So what I intend to do in this paper is to offer a hypothesis to explain the development in Athenian homicide law from Homer to Draco. That is, from the Homeric regime, which features strict liability for homicide and a distinction between homicide by force and homicide by treachery, to the homicide law of Draco, which dispenses with strict liability, distinguishes between intentional and unintentional killing, and penalizes those two offenses differently. Now, I must stress at the outset that this is by necessity hypothetical. It is necessarily hypothetical because the only real evidence we have for Athenian homicide law before the legislation of Draco is the trial and sentencing of the Alcmaeonid clan for the slaughter of the partisans of Cylon. And that is, as we're going to see, a special case. It is a major scandal involving severe violations of religious law. So that case doesn't provide good evidence for the normal treatment of homicide before Draco, whatever that might have been. So the evidence I'm going to present is largely divisible into three categories. The first category consists of survivals of pre-Draconian practices in the historical homicide law of Athens. The second category comprises elements of Draco's law that seem to respond to earlier law. And the third category consists of comparative evidence, including and especially the development of the homicide law of medieval England. So to start out, let's look at the situation regarding homicide in Homer and other early Greek epic. That corpus in general, I will generally refer to using Homer as shorthand. And this is section 1 of the handout, Roman numeral 1. Now, to clarify, when I say homicide, I am generally excluding death in war. Now, there's a lot of killing in Homer, obviously. Canada's own Keanu Reeves, John Wick, has nothing on Homer, even though, I hasten to add, John Wick is very Homeric. You have to see all the movies to understand this. So lots of death in Homer, but for the purposes of this paper, I care about a pretty tiny subset of those deaths. These are killings that do not occur in war, killings for which societies consistently have different and far less permissible rules. Now, another question that has to be confronted out front is, can we categorize these rules as law? Plenty of people have problems with the term Homeric law, which I'm going to be using. Criticism comes both from Homerists, who don't like the use of the word Homeric, and from legal scholars who don't like the use of the word law. Some Homerists object because, as we all know, the Homeric poems contain a strata of composition ranging all the way from the Bronze Age to Homer's own day in the early Archaic period. But despite that fact, as we're going to see, the treatment of homicide is consistent across all early epic, Homer and Hesiod. So in my opinion, that objection does not hold for the purpose of homicide law. Some legal scholars don't like the term Homeric law, don't like the use of the word law, because we have no evidence for written law in Homer. But I belong to the camp that believes in the existence of unwritten law. We know from Julius Caesar that the Druid lawgivers and judges of ancient Gaul and Britain memorized an enormous body of doctrines and were in fact forbidden to reduce them to writing. From about 930 AD at the latest, the Icelandic law speaker was required to recite 1/3 of the entirety of Icelandic law from memory every year at the Althing. Written codification of Icelandic law, what's known as Grágás, did not begin until the year 1117, 1118. The majority of Spartan law was unwritten even in the classical period, long after the advent of the ancient Greek lawgivers. So all this goes to show that I think we are fully justified in speaking of Homeric law. So what was the Homeric law of homicide? As we see in handout item number 1, the rule regarding homicide in Homer and other early epic consistently is that the killer is subject to retaliatory killing by the relatives of his victim, unless he can escape their vengeance by flight or buy it off by compensation, poiné. So in handout 1A, Odysseus tells Telemachus that when a person kills someone, regardless of the number of prospective avengers, he flees into exile. In handout 1B, Ajax explains that the payment of compensation to the victim's family restrains their urge for vengeance and allows the killer to remain in the community. However, the family did not have to accept compensation. This is evident in the famous arbitration scene on the shield of Achilles in Book 18 of the Iliad. And so accordingly, in handout 1C, Nestor tells Telemachus that it is good for a homicide victim to leave behind a son to kill his killer. The victim's family, moreover, might pursue the killer beyond the borders of the community. In handout 1D, Theoclymenus has to stay on the run even after escaping Argos, because his victim has many powerful brothers and other kinsmen who want him dead, and who have the means and capacity to pursue him abroad. And this is why Theoclymenus begs Telemachus to take him aboard his ship and save his life. As we see in handout number 2, in Homer, homicide is a strict liability offense. That means that the killer's mens rea is immaterial. The rule of exile, compensation, or death obtains regardless of whether the killing is intentional or unintentional. The two best illustrations of Homeric strict liability are Patroclus's killing of the son of Amphidamas, handout 2A, and Odysseus's killing of Antinous, handout 2B. In the former case, Patroclus was a young boy, Napios, when he killed his victim, and he did not mean to kill his victim. However, neither Patroclus's youth nor his lack of intent to kill mitigated his liability. Despite those factors, he had to go into exile lest his victim's relatives attempt to kill him in retaliation. In the case of Odysseus and Antinous, handout 2B, the suitors wrongly assume that Odysseus killed Antinous by pure accident, that is, without even intending harm, let alone death. Nonetheless, they intend to kill him immediately in retaliation. This is why they tell him, vultures will eat you here. Even if the suitors had been inclined to accept compensation, they believe that Odysseus is a vagabond beggar, and they therefore assume that he has no way to pay appropriate compensation for the death of Antinous. Even Hyettus, this is handout 2C, who killed Malurus upon finding him in the act of sexual intercourse with his wife in his bed, and therefore would have been immunized by Draco's law for killing a seducer caught in the act, under the Homeric regime for homicide, has to flee Argos and take refuge in Boeotia with King Orchomenus. So as we see in the cases, in particular in the cases of Patroclus and Odysseus, the intent of the killer has no legal relevance, but it might have moral relevance and therefore practical relevance. Victims' families were presumably more willing to accept compensation and to accept compensation at lower amounts for unintentional killing than for intentional killing. But the predominant distinction in Homer is not between the presence or absence of intent, but rather between homicide by superior force, diephi iphi kratei, and homicide by treachery, dolo, handout number 3. So in the Odyssey, when Polyphemus famously raises the hue and cry after being blinded, his neighbors ask him incredulously, handout 3A, whether somebody is trying to kill him by treachery or by force. Dolo ea biephin. Polyphemus responds that Utis is trying to kill him by force, not by treachery. Dolo ou de biephin. The other Cyclopes misinterpret this as meaning no one is trying to kill me by force or by treachery, and so they conclude that he doesn't require their assistance. In this passage, I think we can discern a hint that the force-treachery distinction is not only more important than the distinction as to the killer's intent in Homer, but it's also the older of the two distinctions. The Cyclopes are at such an early stage of civilization that they have mastered animal husbandry, but they have no laws and no assemblies, and they recognize no jurisdiction beyond the domestic. The presence of the forced treachery distinction, even among the literally lawless Cyclopes, indicates, I believe, that Homer was aware of the temporal priority of that distinction. It may further indicate that this forced treachery distinction was in the process of being replaced by the distinction as to the killer's intent, at least in some parts of the Greek world in Homer's own time. Like the intent of the killer, the forced treachery distinction in Homer has no legal relevance, but it has a clear moral relevance. The person who kills by treachery is generally reviled. So in handout 3C, Menelaus heaps scorn upon Aegisthus, who killed Agamemnon by stealth, catching him unawares by the treachery dolo of Clytemnestra. Accordingly, the families of people killed by treachery were presumably less willing to accept compensation and more likely to demand higher levels of compensation than the families of those killed by superior force. As we see in handout 3D, Aegisthus killed Agamemnon specifically by means of a treacherous ambush. An ambush, in fact, was a paradigmatic form of dolos. In one of the lying tales that Odysseus tells to Athena, handout 3E, Odysseus claims that he and a comrade killed Orsilochus by ambushing him next to a road. Even though there were no witnesses, Odysseus says that he went into exile immediately. The nighttime unwitnessed ambush establishes dolos before and during the killing. Odysseus's immediate flight establishes dolos after the fact, as it prevents his detection and identification as the killer. Other examples of ambushes that are either executed or contemplated on the road include Antinous' plan to ambush Telemachus, that's Comparandum A, and Lycurgus' slaying of Areithous, Comparandum C, and I quote, by treachery, not at all by strength, on a narrow road where Areithous' iron club was of no use to prevent his death. Now, this case is particularly interesting owing to the weapon for which Areithous was famous. The iron club, in all probability, of course, indicates a story originating in the Iron Age. So we can conclude that the forced treachery distinction was not merely a Bronze Age relic, but in fact, it persisted into the Iron Age and presumably down to Homer's day and beyond. Indeed, both the consistency of Homeric and other early epic and the inherent probability of a time before the rise of the Greek lawgivers, when the killer's mens rea was not considered, both point to the conclusion that these epics reflect actual Greek practice, at least shortly before and during the time of their written composition. That is, roughly speaking, the 9th, 8th, and or early 7th century, and probably even earlier in the Bronze Age and the pre-Archaic Iron Age. So this brings us to the Homicide Law of Draco, enacted in the archonship of Aristochmus, 620-120. Section 2, Roman numeral 2 on the handout. Draco's law, which I've outlined in handout number 4, is not a strict liability law. It distinguishes between intentional and unintentional killing, and it designates some killings as lawful. Intentional killing is punished by death and confiscation of property. By the 5th century at the latest, intentional killers of non-citizens were punished by permanent exile. Unintentional killing is punished by exile that lasts until pardon is granted by qualified relatives of the victim. People who are in exile for homicide may not be killed or arrested or robbed unless they violate the terms of their exile by entering Attica or by attending the border market or games or amphictyonic rites. Contrast with this the pursuit of Theoclymenus beyond the bounds of Argos in handout 1D. Under Draco's law, killing is lawful if the killer acted in defense of self or property, including specifically against a highway robber on the road. So Draco permits the killing of a would-be killer or robber who, by the Homeric definition, acts with dolos, as Odysseus claims to have done in handout 3E, for example. Draco also indemnifies the killer who kills unintentionally in the games, who mistakenly inflicts a friendly fire casualty in war, or who finds his victim in the act of sexual intercourse with the killer's wife, mother, sister, daughter, or concubine kept for the procreation of free children. So, as Pausanias implies, and Pausanias is the source of the Hesiotic fragment in handout 2C, Hyettus would have been immunized by the later law of Draco. So what was the Athenian law of homicide before Draco? Handout section 3, Roman numeral 3. As I said at the outset, the only actual direct evidence we have for Athenian homicide law before Draco is the trial and sentencing of the Alcmaeonids to a curse and what was supposed to be perpetual exile for the killing of the partisans of Cylon. This is handout number 5. In an Olympic year after 640 and before 621-20, Cylon and his followers seized the Acropolis with the goal of installing Cylon as tyrant, but they were besieged by the Athenians en masse and agreed to a conditional surrender to avoid death by starvation. The archons convinced the Cylonians to abandon sanctuary on the Acropolis by promising that they would suffer no immediate harm and would not be liable to the death penalty. But as the Cylonians came down the hill, they were attacked. Many of them were killed, some even as they sought sanctuary at the altars of the Semnithae on the Areopagus. The Alcmaeonids, one of whom, Megacles, was eponymous archon, were put on trial before a special jury of 300 men chosen by birth. The Alcmaeonid clan as a whole was convicted and sentenced to the aforementioned curse and supposedly perpetual exile, which in fact lasted no longer than 2 generations. Now, this case is our only direct evidence for Athenian homicide law before Draco, but it's of limited, if any, use at all. This is a sui generis incident. I don't think it's really of any use in determining the normal treatment of homicide in pre-Draconian Athens. Now, it is worth pointing out that the archons violating their promise not to harm the Cylonians as they descended the Areopagus, the Acropolis, presents a textbook case of homicide by dolos, homicide by treachery. They make a truce, they violate the truce in the bloodiest way possible. And yet, even so, Draco does not recognize in his law any formal category of homicide by dolos. On the other hand, we do have good indications of the pre-Draconian treatment of homicide in the survival of pre-Draconian practices in the historical period, and in Athenian historical memory of both of the key features of Homeric homicide law. That is, both strict liability and the forced treachery distinction. The most relevant and most informative survival of a pre-Draconian practice in historical Athens is the custom of carrying a spear at the funeral of a homicide victim. Handout number 6. In handout 6A, the exegetai, the interpreters of the sacred law, instructed the speaker of pseudo Demosthenes 47 to carry a spear at the funeral procession of an elderly freed woman who died by homicide. They tell him also to issue a proclamation over the tomb, seeking any relatives she might have, and to stand guard over her tomb for 3 days. Ister, handout 6B, explains that this normally was the duty of the relatives of the victim. Those relatives would plant a spear in the ground at the victim's tomb, quote, because it was customary for relatives to pursue killers in this way, end quote. Pollux, handout 6C, explains that a spear was carried at the funeral procession for people who died violently. Now, this public display of the spear, it's first carried in the funeral procession, and then it is planted in the ground at the victim's tomb. This obviously dates from a time before Draco, from a time when homicide was avenged by the spear, not by the lawsuit, when retaliatory killing was the norm, as it is in Homer. The original purpose of carrying the spear is to serve as public notice of the family's, the victim's family's intent to avenge the victim by killing the killer. This act of publicity formally alerts the killer and his kin, and it formally alerts the community as a whole that in accordance with the ancient Homeric rule, the killer is going to be fair game for violent reprisal by the family of his victim, unless and until compensation is offered and accepted. What Draco did was to convert this proclamation of intent to avenge into a proclamation of intent to prosecute, which he requires under his law. He mandates that, quote, relatives, that is, relatives of the victim, up to first cousin's son and first cousin, shall issue a proclamation to the killer in public. So thus Draco establishes a formal limit for participation in the proclamation. And by the way, I was, as someone who's done some work on homicide law, I was very thrilled some years ago when my first cousin had her first son, otherwise known as my first cousin once removed. I informed her, all right, you have to tell him he must avenge my death. Now, she didn't think this was funny. Neither did I was serious. Then she had another son. I did the same thing. I thought she was going to take a swing at me and therefore require her infant son to come to my aid. Anyway, so
so on both the male side and the female side?
All we know, well, it's descendant first cousin and first cousin once removed. As far as we know, yes, on both sides.
For inheritance, it makes a difference.
Yeah. Now, okay, so we have this pre-draconian practice. Now, also the survival and the transformation of other pre-draconian practices can be seen in the dying injunction issued by a homicide victim, as in Antiphon 1 and in Lysias 13, and in the right of the victim's family to witness the execution of a convicted killer, which is attested in Demosthenes 23. Originally, the dying injunction of the victim is a call for blood. It's not a call for a lawsuit, which is what it becomes. And the victim's family's right to witness the killer's execution is the attenuated remnant of their original right to kill the killer. The Athenians, moreover, retained a historical memory of a time when homicide was subject to Homeric strict liability. This is handout number 7. As we see in handout 7A, one of the foundation myths of the Delphinian court, this is the trial venue for defendants who assert an affirmative defense of lawful homicide. One of the foundation myths of this court held that Theseus was the first person in Athens, not just that, he was the first person in Greece, according to this myth, successfully to mount an affirmative defense of this sort. Quote, earlier, before Theseus was acquitted, it had been established for all that a killer must flee, or else, if he stayed, be killed just like his victim. Now, obviously, we don't need to take this myth seriously in order to see in it a genuine historical memory of a time when in Athens, as generally in Greece, homicide was a strict liability offense. The evidence of tragedy, for example, in handout 7B, the contention of the chorus in Aeschylus's Coephony. It is the law that drops of blood spilled on the ground demand further blood. This may constitute corroborating evidence, although we, of course, have to account for significant Homeric influence. Tragedy also preserves the memory of the forced treachery distinction, handout number 8, and does so even in stories that do not descend in the main from the Homeric tradition. For example, in the OT, handout 8A, Oedipus accuses Creon of attempted homicide with Dolos. In Euripides' Hippolytus, handout 8B, Artemis condemns the Dolos of Phaedra that led to the death of Hippolytus. By contrast, in the Coephony, handout 8C, Orestes immediately publicizes his killing of Clytemnestra. Quote, I declare to my friends and state that I killed my mother not without justice, the polluted killer of my father, an object of the gods' hatred, end quote. So in that case, there is no dolos after the fact, as there is, for example, in handout 3E. So, how do we get from Homer to Draco? I think that comparative legal evidence is particularly useful in answering this question. This is section 4 of the handout. Now, obviously, by its very nature, comparative evidence is not probative. In this case, though, I think it is highly suggestive. Most of my comparanda are going to come from medieval English and Icelandic law. I will start with comparanda for Homeric strict liability. Early Germanic legal systems, such as those of medieval England and Iceland, generally concurred with Homer in asserting strict liability for homicide, although they did set some limits on strict liability. Liability is not absolutely strict. In medieval English law, handout number 9, the most famous expression of the principle of strict liability appears several times in the Leges Henrici Primi, which, despite the conventional title, are not, in fact, laws enacted by King Henry I. They are rather laws of various dates that were in force during Henry's reign. The compilation dates to between 1114 and 1118. This is handout 9A. The rule there states, it is a principle of law that he who transgresses unwittingly shall make amends wittingly. The Latin legis enim est qui inscienter peccat scienter emendet translates the original Old English, saith Recht unueldus beta ueldus. This principle is specifically applied to homicide, in Leges Henrici Primi 70, 12 to 12b. It is there stated that if a woman commits homicide, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, she shall pay compensation, or else vengeance may be taken upon her or her blood relatives. Even in the case of pure accident, as in a game of archery, compensation must be paid. Strict liability in England goes all the way back to the very first written English laws, those of King Ethelbert of Kent, handout 9b, in which the weregild of 100 shillings payable for homicide applies to both intentional and unintentional killing. In handout 9c, Alfred's provisions for homicide caused by a person impaling himself on a spear carried by another over his shoulder. There are some pretty severe difficulties of interpretation, but it is clear that at least in the case where the spear point is in front of the carrier, if the death is ruled an accident, the carrier must pay the victim's weregild, but he is excused from paying the witte, which is the supplemental fine that's usually payable to the king. Provisions of the Icelandic law book Bragas, handout number 10, demonstrate that strict liability with some limits also applied in medieval Iceland. And interestingly, Bragas is almost an exact contemporary of the Leges Henrici Primi. Compilation of Bragas began in 1117, 1118, and 1118 is the latest possible year for the completion of the compilation of the Leges Henrici Primi. Now, as to strict liability in Bragas, the famous declaration in Koningsbok 92, that hermelt at engiskole verda vadaverk, it is prescribed that there shall be no such things as accidental acts. That's not literally true. However, the penalty of outlawry, handout 10b, applies regardless of whether a killing is intentional or unintentional. The law states simply, if a person kills another person, then that is punishable by outlaw. The same applies to the right of vengeance, handout 10c. Qualified relatives of a homicide victim have the right to kill the killer before the next meeting of the Althing, whether the killer acted intentionally or not. The payment of weregild, too, handout 10d, was identical in all cases, except when the victim was found to have forfeited his immunity. The most obvious case of forfeit immunity being the outlaw. So while liability for homicide in Icelandic law was not absolutely strict, obviously the principle of strict liability informs multiple fundamental and definitional elements of the legal regime for homicide. So that's strict liability. Now to turn to comparanda for the Homeric distinction between homicide by superior force and homicide by treachery. Equivalents of Homeric dolos, treachery, appear intriguingly in Roman law and more informatively in English and Icelandic law. Now, I am not going to open the giant can of worms that is the Roman leges regii, but, and this is handout number 11, a lex regia attributed to Numa does provide that the person who kills a free person dolo shall be a parakidas, and this supposed lex regia is also written in clearly archaic language. Now, dolo here may mean simply with wrongful intent. That's the common meaning of the Latin term dolus in later Roman law. But the possibility that it means treacherously is suggested at least by the also very early parallel of 12 Tables 8-9, where dolo must mean by treachery or with deceit. We have more informative comparanda in medieval English and Icelandic law. In England, handout number 12, morth, whose biform morðr eventually becomes modern English murder, is distinguished from simple homicide, in later terminology manslaughter, by concealment of the killing. This is the original distinction between murder and manslaughter in English law. The most famous statement of this distinction appears in the late 12th century in the Tractatus attributed to Glanville, handout 12b. It states there are two types of homicide. One is what is called murdrum. Murdrum is a Latin loan word out of Middle English morther, which descends from the nearly identical Old English. One is what is called murdrum, which is committed in secret, with no one seeing and no one knowing except the killer himself and his accomplices. There is also another type of homicide, which is called simple homicide, simplex homicidium. This same distinction is already present in the probably 9th century Schriftbuch. This is handout 12a. Quote, if a person kills another in an act of morth, in an angry state of mind and with concealment, he shall fast for 4 years, some ordain 7, end quote. So how do you, the killer, avoid concealment and therefore prevent becoming liable for morth? What you are supposed to do is publicize the killing immediately after you commit it. We see this in the Leges Henrici Primi, handout 12c. The killer shall make an announcement at the nearest village and to the first person he encounters, and also to the soakholder. If the killer fails to publicize the deed, that's concealment. You are concealing either the killing itself or at the very least your role in it. And that concealment makes you liable for morth. The slayer of a thief caught in the act was immunized by a declaration and proof as to that fact, at least from the time of the relevant provision in the laws of Ina. So this is nothing new during the time of Henry I. Unlike in Homer, the forced treachery distinction in English law had a vital and fundamental ramification for killers and their families, because simple homicide was compensable, but as we see in handout 12d, morth was not compensable. Manifest morth, and that's not an oxymoron, manifest morth means morth that comes to light despite an attempt at concealment. Manifest morth is non-compensable under secular law. So English homicide law has a publication requirement. After you kill, you must publish the killing. Iceland had a very similar publication requirement. Handout number 13. Gragas states the general rule. Where men go only one way from a killing, then the killer is to publish the killing as his work within the next 12 hours. If a killer publishes in the required form and to the required people, the killing is vig. Vig is the Icelandic equivalent of Glanville's simple homicide. Today, vig is often translated in English as manslaughter. If, however, the medieval Icelandic killer failed to publish properly, Or a fortiori, to quote Gragas, if he hides the killing or conceals the corpse or does not admit it, then the killing is morth, murder. Same word in Old Icelandic as it is in Old English. So, for example, in Loxdale Saga, after Bolli kills Kjartan, he publishes the killing as required and so becomes liable for Vik instead of morth. Gragas ordains that the person accused of morth cannot offer the defense of justified killing. But other than that, the consequences of the two offenses are identical. The legal penalty for both morth and Vik is outlawry. The weregild payable for the two offenses is the same. And the reward for killing the person outlawed for each offense is the same. 3 marks of silver, that is 24 ounces of silver. So we have in both England and Iceland laws of homicide that display, I think, remarkable, albeit of course not total, correspondence with the Homeric and pre-Draconian law of homicide, while being completely free of Homeric influence. So in fact, I think we have something atavistically Indo-European going on here. The major differences lie in, first, the emphasis on treachery before and during the fact in Homer versus treachery after the fact in England and Iceland. Second, the fact that compensation is formally fixed in England and Iceland, but it is not formally fixed in Homer. And third, we have to deal with the non-compensability of morth in the laws of Knut, which has no Homeric or other pre-Draconian equivalent. But otherwise, we have situations in which, first, the families of homicide victims are expected to avenge them in blood unless they decide to accept compensation. Second, that compensation is to be paid regardless of the state of mind of the killer. It doesn't matter whether he killed intentionally or unintentionally. And third, treachery on the part of the killer is at least a morally aggravating factor, even when it does not constitute a legally aggravating factor. Now, the transition from Homeric strict liability and forced treachery distinction to Draco's law, which distinguishes intentional from unintentional killing and lacks a forced treachery distinction. This too finds a striking parallel in the development of homicide law from medieval to early modern England, handout number 14. In England, during that period, the distinguishing factor between murder and manslaughter, to use the modern terms, changed from concealment to malice aforethought. We still find the term malice aforethought in the common law. It first occurs in a statute in its law French form, malice coupons, in 1389. Now, this change meant that the previous distinction, based on the killer's actions during and after the killing, was replaced by a new distinction as to the killer's state of mind before and during the killing. And along with this new distinction, strict liability was almost totally eliminated. We still have a partial exception surviving today in the felony murder rule. I propose that something similar happened in Athens. By the time of Draco, the old forced treachery distinction was receding in importance compared to the killer's intent, and Draco's law sounded the virtual death knell for the old system. But that was by no means inevitable. In some Greek cities, the forced treachery distinction must have survived. See section 5 of the handout. This is item number 15. The forced treachery distinction must have survived in some places or else Aristotle would not have distinguished the violent offense of homicide, thanatos, from the secret offense of homicide by dolos, dolophonia. Strict liability probably survived in some places too. This is indicated by Herodotus's famous story of Attis and Adrastus, section 6 of the handout, item number 16. Despite the location and the dramatis personae, this is a thoroughly Greek story. Even the name of Adrastus, of course, is purely Greek. Adrastus has been expelled into exile by his father Gordius for killing his brother unintentionally, aekon. This is one of the volitional terms used by Draco in his law. Adrastus is purified by Croesus and assigned to serve as bodyguard for Croesus' son Attis on the hunt for the Mysian boar. During the hunt, Adrastus kills Attis purely by accident. He throws his spear at the boar, misses the boar, strikes and kills Attis. He nonetheless asks Croesus to kill him, and Croesus replies that he already has full recompense since Adrastus has condemned himself to death. Herodotus thus expects his readers to comprehend without difficulty a situation in which even a purely and completely accidental homicide might be punished by death. So even long after Draco had eliminated that possibility in Athens, it probably remained in some form in some parts of the Greek world. So Draco deserves the credit for enshrining in written law, if not necessarily in all cases for personally creating, the innovations that his homicide law contained. He outlawed retaliatory killing. The exiled killer who appeared of his own volition in a forbidden place might be killed by anyone, but killers who obeyed the terms of their exile were granted legal protection from vengeful relatives of their victims and from anybody else. Draco eliminated the penalty of death for unintentional killing, and he established that killing under certain circumstances was lawful. He formalized and regularized the process of pardon that allowed exiled killers to return to Attica. All of this goes to show that whatever may have been the case with his other laws, Draco's homicide law gives the lie to the famous assertion of Demosthenes reported in Plutarch's Life of Solon, that Draco wrote his laws not in ink, but in blood. Thank you very much.
Wow, that covers a lot of territory, a lot of cultural contexts, and exemplary use of a handout. Are there questions from all of you? Please.
So, I mean, I think the concealment distinction is kind of like there's a corollary in like the public-private distinction and kind of the lex Justinian that like confirmed the lex Aelia that you see coming out of the Roman social war. So I think there's a corollary there a bit, but I guess the point I'm kind of alluding to is like what's interesting about the punishments for murders is that we know that relatively that a lot of these punishments weren't it's impossible to equally enforce them. So the enforcement of punishment is inherently an economic relationship between people. So the development of this law very much like tracks with the actual development or the changes in the economic context and the economic relations and the economic property rights that are being established in those societies at that time. Because basically it's essentially like varying a punishment for a law is basically removing the same weight of debt obligation on a class of people against another class of people, which is basically, I think, the lens through which I kind of understand stuff. So I'm just curious on your thoughts, if you see this as being an economic motive for the changes in these laws.
You mean for Draco?
Well, Draco is a really good example, especially because this is occurring amidst the massive economic transformation in human societies.
Well, not quite yet, not quite yet in Draco's time. Athens doesn't really become a regional economic powerhouse until the aftermath of Solon, until the Pisistrative period. In Draco's time, Athens is still a relative backwater. But I think, okay, so one thing that would affect my answer is this. So there is a debate among the literally dozens of us who care deeply about this, with regard to Draco's law. So we hear in the later lexicographers about what is called hypophonia. Hypophonia is payment that is made to the victim's family to avert a lawsuit. And the debate is this legal? And I don't know what the majority opinion is. My opinion is no, it was not legal. And if I'm right, if payment to avert trial is illegal, and if Draco actually established that, because there's no question that whether it was legal or not, people did it, right? People break the law, right? So before Draco, under the Homeric system, of course, every case of compensation for homicide is subject to negotiation between the killer's family and the victim's family. Everything is ad hoc. There are no fixed weregild amounts, as you find in medieval England and Iceland. So, of course, economics comes into play there. If Draco outlawed hypophonia, which I think he did, you could make an economic argument that maybe this is very, very proto-democratic of him, because he doesn't want to give an advantage to wealthy families that can buy off killings. You know, the equivalent of the famous story of, I forget whichever obnoxious Roman it was, who, when there was a fine of 25 asses for injuria, went around slapping people and had his slave just pay him out, right? So maybe that gets to your point, but I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, just to be clear, when I talked about economic changes, I wasn't referring to the wealth of Athens, for example. So one of the things, so yeah, like someone comes in, creates a cash crop system, that there's an expansion of those, like, basically those trade networks. But the context is, in Draco's time, you have, and this is what leads to the reforms of Solon, is that you have an essential inequality between, there's no protections against being sold into bondage if you're an Athenian citizen. So you're simply subject to that. And so when it comes, so for that's what I was referring to on an economic basis. I wasn't saying Athens was an economic powerhouse at the time. I was referring to like the internal social relations between, and essentially this is about your membership in a tribe, right? Because the ability to be avenged by a broader extended family group is like directly dependent on you having that family group. And if you don't have that, so if you're, and of course, it becomes more relevant later, you're urbanized and you don't simply have that protection. But I think the variation in penalty amounts is like we first get penalty amounts and like they're an anomaly, right? Like, so there's penalty amounts going back from the Babylonian law codices that are basically influencing this trade in the entire region. But I think in this particular case, I really think that it is a pro-democratic thing of Draco, because that's exactly the intent I think is being established. If you're a dictator in this environment, what you want to do in order to gain popular support is create situations that ameliorate the economic punishment for a broad class of people that are going to support you against the regional elites that are competing for your position. And so I just kind of read these variations in the law right through to like the unreaching premium and all the other ones as reflecting the economic relationships with people involved in it.
Yeah, the problem with that with Draco is that Draco, as far as we know, held no office. Draco certainly was not tyrant or dictator or anything like that. We know he was not eponymous archon in the year of his reforms. The only thing we know about Draco, besides a truly bizarre story that the people of Egina loved him so much that they unintentionally smothered him to death, is the fact, yeah, I mean, so Draco apparently was the world's first rock star. He goes to Egina, he's speaking in public, and the story is that the Aeginetans start taking off their cloaks and like throwing them in his pile of, death by wool. I don't know. But yeah, so Draco is not that kind of figure. And I for one I don't belong to the Raymond Westbrook school of Greek law being the westernmost law of the ancient Near East. I don't think that works, but I do appreciate your thoughts. I'm going to think some more about economic ramifications. Thank you.
Please.
Para-legalistic question that fits with this idea of dolos, an ambush as a form of dolos. Could we ever speak of a bleeding into the battlefield of the legal terminology and look at the ritualism and lack of imagination of a hoplite battle into some sort of conception that anything that is not straightforward is actually dolos and hence legally inappropriate?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yes. Yeah, we could. I don't think the one determines the other. Because, for example, in Homer, there's nothing wrong with ambush in warfare, right? You're supposed to use ambush in warfare, right? This is a good thing, right? As I said in the beginning, right? The reason I'm not dealing with killings in war, these are not homicide in the normal sense, because you have far fewer rules in war. And in ancient Greek culture in general, ambush itself cannot have been universally looked down upon, or we would not have personal names like Archilokos or Silokos. You've got Lochitis, the defendant in Isocrates 20. You've got all these Lokos names, all these names with ambush. And clearly, ambush, it wasn't simply and across the board the case that ambush is bad. Yeah, does that address your question? Yeah.
It's perhaps a broader range question, maybe more historiographical. Made some really interesting connections between a few different cultures and points in time and different law codes. What motivated you to form those connections? Like, how did you come across all this in your research?
Probably the ultimate root of this was, so when I was an undergraduate, I took 2 terms of Old English. And during that, this culminated, of course, with reading Beowulf, because that's what you do. But for some reason, the professor in one of those courses made us read Njal's Saga in English, not Icelandic. And so I thought, well, this is interesting, right? And I found there and in other sagas stuff that I thought, and this was before I even had a dissertation idea. I was still an undergraduate, but once I went to graduate school and decided I was going to do a dissertation on essentially Athenians hurting and killing each other, I sort of went back to this stuff and I thought, well, there are some commonalities there. And what's really interesting to me is that it is utterly impossible that these medieval Englishmen and Icelanders, none of them are reading the Attic Oracles, right? None of them are reading Homer even. They've heard of Homer, but they're not reading it. So there's no connection. And so I just thought it was fascinating. And then, during the pandemic, as one does, I taught myself Old Norse, because once I found toilet paper, I was like, well, what do I do now? So yeah, I mean, I've been interested in this, you know, at least vaguely interested for almost 30 years.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's a very good explanation, thanks.
So is that comparison then warranted by the quasi-egalitarian, proto-democratic nature of, let's say, Icelandic and Greek societies?
According to Seller, is the last item of the bibliography. The answer is kind of yes. It's a very interesting little article comparing mostly Homer and specifically the Homeric Basileus, the dynasts, local rulers, whatever you want to call them, and the Icelandic Godar chieftains. So look there for it. He gets into that much more than I would. I wouldn't lean too heavily on the necessity that the societies look broadly familiar. For me, it suffices, and it's far more important that the relevant laws look broadly familiar than that the societies as a whole. But Seller is a good starting point for that.
There's a really good contrast though between, I think, the law code you find either that maintains in Scandinavia versus the one that's established in Iceland, because they're essentially fleeing to prevent a central unitary state.
Yep.
And all the laws that come with that. And there's a direct series of economic relationships between these tribal chieftains, but they're saying we want to enforce this old tribal system because we don't want the same unified. And I think you see that the legal structures are they diverge quite sharply there because of that difference.
Yeah, when you have no central authority.
Yeah.
When the closest thing you have is the annual meeting of the Althing. And you use the Althing for all kinds of things, including the terminus ad quem for killing the person who killed your relative. Yeah.
Just a quick question. In the OT, does Oedipus, does he kill his father lawfully? We were okay.
Lawfully.
Okay.
There is a. Now David is smiling because he knows that
We talked about this in his class.
that one Edward Harris, I think, has a divergent opinion. The answer is, and I don't know what David's opinion about this is, but mine is he is absolutely entitled because he is outnumbered and he does not strike the first blow. So yes, under Athenian law, he should be acquitted. It would be a travesty of justice if he were convicted. I mean, to this day, if multiple attackers accost you on the road and strike you first, in most jurisdictions, you have the right to respond with lethal force. Just like it.
I do agree with that. Yeah.
For those dark alleys.
Also, I think anyone who has had to walk around campus when it's crowded will want to remember that Liason has been word blocking the road and Oedipus was trying to travel.
Well, right, and they struck him first. I mean, I would have led with that. And yeah, and second point is
Yes.
that he's outnumbered.
What's your underlying definition of law? What's the definition used for law?
Oddly, I don't believe I have ever. Well, a law is a rule with a remedy. Right? I think that's as good as I can briefly define law, because since I believe in unwritten law, I don't think that writing is a prerequisite for law. I think it's a good idea to write down laws. I don't think you have to. So law is a rule and a remedy.
Just check online for Q&As.
Oh, we've got 4. Okay, number 1, in most of these homicide cases, who individuals' bodies was capable and or responsible responsible for implementing the law's consequences and how?
Okay, who is responsible for implementing the law's consequences and how? So the general answer to that is the relatives of the victim. Sometimes the qualified group is defined, so it's defined under Draco's law. The relatives of the victim who are qualified to prosecute my killing are my male relatives down to and including my descendant first cousins once removed. Gragos has a rule about this, but I don't remember what it is. In other cases, in Homer, for example, we know that it's just generally the kinsman of the victim.
Great, thanks. There's a second question. Were there differentiations of judgment or punishment based on means or types of homicide, poisoning versus stabbing, stoning, strangling, combat, and so on?
In Athenian law, the only distinction I can think of is a distinction without a difference, because in Athenian law, separate from Draco's law on homicide, there is also, we know there was a law on pharmakeia, poisoning, but the only law we have on pharmakeia is a law that provides that jurisdiction goes to the court of the Areopagus, which is where, in any event, the case would go if you were accused of intentionally killing an Athenian citizen, whether by poison or your fists or a sword or a spear or renting an elephant and dropping it on them. If you intend to kill, it goes to the Areopagus.
There's a third question. Why do you think there are strict rules as to who can prosecute the killer, as in Demosthenes 47, whereas in many other cases, third-party prosecution had been made available?
I think it's particularly important in the Athenian context of Draco's law because that same kin group, or almost exactly the same kin group that has the right to prosecute, also has the right to pardon. And that pardon must be unanimous. The rule is that all the qualified relatives must agree to pardon the unintentional killer, or the unintentional killer stays in exile. And because that's essentially identical to the prosecution group, that's why I think it's so important for Draco to spell out that it goes down exactly to descendant first cousin once removed.
Great. And last one here. Could you please define how homicide would be considered just versus unjust, akin to just or unjust wars? Now, there's a big kettle of fish.
Yeah, very big. A big kettle full of enormous, vicious fish. The only way I can think of off the top of my head to approach that is that generally we believe in a doctrine of justifiable self-defense in both cases. Both in the micro case of an individual who is attacked, and if you attack me with lethal force, I have the right to respond with lethal force, and I'm justified. And if I'm successful in my defensive lethal force, whereas you are not justified if you're the aggressor, I think that broadly speaking, we have a comparandum to that on a much larger scale in the modern just war doctrine. And that's all I'm going to say.
That's probably wise to stop there. That's great. You talking about the Homeric texts and this strict liability, but we do get a sense that they are at least aware of unintentional homicide, and yet you're saying that they're not actually recognizing that as having, as mattering for legal purposes.
It doesn't matter legally, it matters morally, or it can matter morally. So we are clearly, Homer wants us to sympathize with Patroclus because he killed when he was Napios. He killed when he was a young boy and he didn't mean to. We are supposed to sympathize with that, even though in reality in quotation marks, right? In the reality of Homer's world, it didn't matter. Even the very, very underage killer who didn't mean to kill had to be sent into exile so he didn't become a target. So that's what I mean by it doesn't matter as a matter of law, but still matters.
But in the negotiations that we see on the shield scene, for instance, it matters there likely in moral terms, in terms of how that negotiation would go on. The assumption seems to be that if it were an unintentional killing, really the person who's refusing to take payment really ought to have done so. And that seems to be what Ajax is saying in book 9, right? You accept the compensation.
I think that's right. But I think it's important to acknowledge that neither in the shield scene in Iliad 18, nor when Ajax is talking to Achilles in Iliad 9, in neither of those cases is it stated or even strongly implied that the killer in question is an unintentional killer. Ajax just states it as a general rule. And I think you're absolutely right that community pressure will have been strong on the family of a victim of unintentional homicide to accept compensation and to do so at reasonable levels. Yeah, I think that's.
What do you think we can learn about, what could contemporary society learn from ancient Athenian homicide?
Don't do it. Don't do it. I mean, this is not a model for us, right? You know, so do you want to live under these rules, right? If you kill intentionally, if you kill a citizen, right? Because the Athenians have this citizen, non-citizen distinction. Do we want to have different penalties for the killing of citizens and non-citizens? Probably not. Do we want to somehow try to manage a penalty of exile? Probably not. So I don't think, look, the Athenian legal system can tell us all kinds of things about the Athenians. And occasionally, when we have evidence that a legal norm was similar elsewhere about other ancient Greeks, I don't think we should be taking lessons from the Athenians, except don't do it.
I have one last question, and you can choose not to answer it. It has to do with miasma. And what role, I mean, we've managed to avoid that so far. And yet, you know, in the Oedipus the King, it's the starting point of the play. And certainly to circle back to our friend, Edward Harris, he thinks it's really important. So how does it fit into your picture, or would it?
In two ways. One, there is no miasma in Homer. It doesn't exist. Now there are people who have tried to locate it and to sort of extrapolate from certain passages. But I don't think there's anything like the classical or later archaic miasma doctrine in Homer. So for Homer, I'd say it doesn't exist. In Draco's law, it doesn't exist. In Athenian law, it exists insofar as, and I think this is spelled out by the author of the Athpal, the reason that the special homicide courts in Athens, of which there were 5, are all in the open air, is that so you have to be much more worried about miasma, like any communicable disease, when you're in an enclosed space under the same roof, right? We all learned this starting in 2019. Well, it was already true for miasma. So this is why we're told the homicide courts are open air. The other thing about miasma is, and I think if I remember Harris's position on this, I'm pretty sure I've expressed agreement with him about this, which is, namely, I think that lawful killings did not produce miasma. Now in the OT, this is a problem, right? But the OT is, put it this way, the OT is not the humanities. The OT is not trying to explain, here's why this aspect of Athenian homicide law became the way it was, right? It's not an Athenian story. So I don't have a problem with the fact that, yes, Thebes is suffering from acute and chronic miasma owing to Oedipus's killing of Lagus. So I think we got separate issues here. I think.
So you wouldn't be sympathetic to Rene Girard reading in miasma for the Iliad?
Can you specify?
So are you familiar with Rene Girard? He did like
Only the name.
okay. So like he has this entire arc of theory that like essentially there's a social contagion that occurs from mimicry of like a scapegoat function in society, and so he would agree with you in the sense that like lawful and unlawful killing is the distinction, because unlawful killing creates a need for it creates a social dysfunction that's unconsciously mimicked, and then creates the need for society to produce a scapegoat to then excise that miasma or that social contagion. And so he reads that in to like, you know, in his thesis, he's like a French theologian, right? Like mid-20th century. So he reads it into like across like classical literature.
No.
Yeah.
I would not agree.
That's one out there. Yeah, never mind. It's not. Did violence in the sacred, it's a good one. But it's also very sympathetic to John Shay's take on that famous Paul novel on killing in Vietnam or whatever. Yeah, it's the same deal. I think John Shay was ripping off of Gerard Way.
Well, do you have,
Where is it there 300 scenes?
All right. Even though I'm being recorded, I'm going to answer that question. My favorite line from 300, and do not read too much into this. Like I'm painfully aware of all the various critiques of the politics of the movie 300. I like the movie 300 because it's entertainment and for no other reason. That being said, my favorite line, and I'll probably get it wrong, right? So Xerxes says to Gerard Leonidas Butler, you know, why don't you just lay down your arms and we can engage in the sharing of cultures, right? And Gerard Leonidas Butler looks back at Xerxes and he says, we've been sharing our culture with you all morning. That's my favorite part.
well, that's a good place to stop. We've got a table booked probably for right now.
15 minutes.
Oh, okay.
By the time we get to get there.
That's great. So please join us for some pizza and things to drink over at Beer Craft. And again, thanks very much, David. Wonderful.